Welcome to another deep dive, everybody. And today we are talking about something that's, well, it's ripped right from the headlines. A proposal to completely revamp how the United States approaches deportation.
Wow.
And the big twist is using private companies to do it.
Yeah.
So imagine like being caught up in the system, but it's being run by, for-profit contractors. Like that's the world that this plan wants to make. And we're going to take a look at it using investigative articles and opinion pieces from all over the place.
Oh, cool.
And even an account from a former Blackwater contractor to try and help us make sense of this whole thing.
Very cool.
So what's real? What's just talk?
Yeah.
And what could this mean for, everyday people?
It is ambitious is an understatement, I think.
Yeah.
This proposal wants to deport 12 million people, but in just 2 years.
Oh, wow.
So to put that in perspective, the U.S. government, they only deport about 250,000 people every year right now.
Yeah.
So if this goes through, we're looking at a potential 600% increase.
600%.
And that would need like a massive increase in resources, a ton more infrastructure just to handle that many people.
600%. That's wild. I mean, I knew the proposal called for a big increase, but honestly, it didn't really hit me how big until you just put it like that.
Yeah.
And this would all be run by private companies, not government agencies. Are we sure about that?
That's what they're proposing, yeah. Private companies would be in charge of everything.
Really?
From actually apprehending people to running what they're calling these processing camps.
Hold on.
On military bases, they even want to run their own, private fleet of planes to ship people out.
Okay, processing camps.
Yeah.
I mean, that phrase, it's a little loaded, right?
It is, very
That's the term the proposal actually uses.
straight from the proposal.
It feels so, I don't know, intentional, right? Like they're trying to be provocative. It's almost like something you'd hear in a dystopian movie or something.
Yeah, you're not wrong. And it makes you wonder, what would conditions be like in these places?
Yeah.
How would people be treated? Especially when you consider who's behind all of this.
Oh, right. We haven't even gotten to that. This is Eric Prince's plan, right? The Blackwater guy.
One and the same.
That definitely complicates things. I mean, he's a controversial figure, to put it lightly.
That might be the understatement of the century.
Right.
I mean, Blackwater, or Academy as it's called now,
Right. They changed their name.
gained a lot of notoriety during the Iraq War.
Yeah.
Involved in a number of incidents, most notably, I think, the 2007 Nusawar Square massacre.
Right.
Where Blackwater contractors killed 17 Iraqi civilians.
And, to make things even messier, Trump pardoned 4 of those contractors back in 2020.
Yeah, that was a controversial move.
Yeah. So how does that play into this?
Right.
There's no accountability there.
Right.
And now we're talking about a plan to give these private contractors even more power in a law enforcement context.
That's the big concern. A lot of legal experts have looked at this, and it's a huge red flag. I mean, giving private companies this level of power, no real oversight, no accountability.
Yeah.
I mean, you're just asking for trouble.
Yeah.
Especially with Blackwater and Eric Prince's track record.
It's like we're handing over the keys to the prison to a company that's known for breaking the rules. It's a little unsettling, to say the least.
For sure.
And before we even get into the legal issues, don't we need to talk about how deportation actually works right now?
Absolutely.
Because you said the current system only handles a tiny part of what this plan is proposing.
Yeah, so right now, deportation is mostly handled by Immigration and Customs Enforcement.
I see.
Or IC. Yeah. It's a federal agency.
Gotcha.
And it's a process. It takes time. They have to identify someone, apprehend them. Often they're detained. Then there's a hearing before an immigration judge. And only then are they potentially deported if their appeals are unsuccessful.
So it's not just rounding people up and throwing them on a plane. There are some legal checks and balances in place.
There are, yeah.
Oh.
Even if the system has its flaws, it's not just a free-for-all.
Okay, that makes sense. But it sounds like this proposal wants to just skip all that and basically hand the whole thing over to these for-profit companies.
Yeah, essentially. And that's where a lot of the critics are saying, hold on.
Yeah.
Not only is it ethically really questionable,
yeah,
it's probably not even legal. I mean, there are laws that restrict how much of law enforcement can be privatized, and something on this scale, deporting 12 million people,
yeah,
it almost certainly violates existing laws.
Yeah, I mean, there's already so much debate about ICE and what they do.
Right.
To just give that power to a company that, their bottom line is profit.
Mm-hmm.
it just seems like setting ourselves up for a disaster. And that's before we even get to, like, how would they even do it?
Right.
You know, the logistics of deporting 12 million people.
The logistics are mind-boggling.
Did the proposal even try to address that part?
It tries, but most experts say it falls way short. The hurdles are massive, probably impossible to overcome.
Really?
I mean, think about it. Finding millions of people, detaining them, processing them, transporting them, all while working with other countries to make sure they'll even take them back.
Yeah, it's just massive.
It's a logistical nightmare.
Didn't one expert say the real cost would be way more than the proposal says, like closer to $80 billion?
Spot on. One expert put it at $80 billion, maybe even more.
Wow.
This is a massive undertaking.
Yeah.
And the price tag could easily get out of control. And that's not even considering the legal challenges that would almost certainly pop up.
Right.
And, of course, the human cost. You're talking about uprooting millions of lives.
Okay, so we've got this huge proposal, super controversial guy leading the charge. It might be illegal. The budget's probably way off.
Yeah, that about sums it up.
What's next? What else do we need to look at to understand this?
To really wrap our heads around this, I think we need to hear from someone who's lived in this world. We have that firsthand account from Morgan Lorette. He used to be a Blackwater contractor.
Right.
And he talks about something he calls the mercenary mindset.
That piece is chilling, seriously. He talks about, like, becoming numb to violence, putting profit ahead of the mission, even getting distant from his own family because of the work he was doing.
It's a sobering look at what can happen when you give this kind of power to private contractors.
Absolutely.
Lorette, he uses this really powerful analogy. He compares himself to, like, a single-serve Starbucks cup. Useful for a time, and then easily tossed away.
That's bleak.
It is.
But it really speaks to how dehumanizing this kind of work can be for both the contractors and the people they're going after.
Right. And when you put that account side by side with the vague language and the proposal, the processing camps,
right,
the lack of any clear oversight, it's really worrying. There's so much potential for abuse.
It's not just about logistics or laws. It's a moral issue, too. We're talking about real people, real lives being affected. And Lorette, he tells this story about terrifying an Iraqi woman, like firing his gun near her. And he says at the time, he felt no remorse at all.
It's hard to hear.
It is.
And it makes you wonder, what happens when you give people like that the power to decide who gets detained, who gets deported?
It's a scary thought. And it really highlights the ethical problems with this whole proposal.
It certainly does.
And beyond the ethics, there's the politics, too.
Oh, yeah.
It feels like, I don't know, the whole issue of immigration, it's so political these days.
It's a minefield.
It's hard to even talk about it without, like, things getting heated.
Yeah, any conversation about immigration tends to get very charged.
Right, and this proposal is definitely playing into that.
It is. The language they use, saving the economy, blaming immigrants for crime, it's the same rhetoric we've been hearing from certain politicians for years.
Yeah, exactly. It's very like us versus them. It's divisive.
Exactly. And that kind of language can be really dangerous.
It can. So we've got this plan that seems to disregard the human cost. It's playing into these political divisions.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack.
What else do we need to look at to really understand this proposal?
Well, there's another perspective we need to consider, and it's a pretty strong one.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Michael Moore, he calls this whole thing a power grab, almost a coup.
Oh, wow. Okay, so we're going there. His piece was definitely the most, let's say, outspoken one of the bunch.
He doesn't mince words.
No, he doesn't.
And he argues that this isn't really about immigration at all. It's about tearing down democratic institutions.
Really?
And consolidating power in the hands of a select few.
That's a serious accusation. I mean, I can see how he gets there, but it's a pretty extreme take, isn't it?
It is, for sure. Moore's take is definitely provocative. Some might even say over the top.
Yeah.
But it brings up this important question. What's the bigger picture here?
Right.
What's the political context we're operating in? Because we've seen a willingness to push boundaries, to ignore norms.
Yeah.
So in that light, is a drastic move on immigration really that far-fetched?
I mean, no, not really.
Right. It's something to consider, even if you don't fully agree with Moore's take.
Okay, so we've got a whole spectrum of opinions here. Some people see this as a real attempt to deal with illegal immigration.
Right.
Others see it as, the cynical power play.
Mm-hmm.
But let's just set the politics aside for a minute.
Okay.
What about the actual impact?
The human cost, you mean?
Yeah, the human cost. We've talked about the logistics, the ethics.
It's hard to even fathom, really.
But what about the people? What would this actually mean for them?
Imagine, living every day with the fear of deportation hanging over you.
Yeah.
You never know if, a simple traffic stop could be the thing that gets you separated from your family, your job.
Oh, man.
Your whole life just gone.
It's heartbreaking to think about. And Lorette's story, the Blackwater guy.
Yeah.
It really drives that home. He talks about shutting down his emotions to the point where he could inflict fear, even violence, without a second thought.
It's disturbing.
And if that's the mindset of the people who are going to be carrying out these deportations,
right?
What kind of system are we creating?
One that ignores basic human rights in the name of efficiency.
Wow.
In the name of profit. I mean, we could see tons of people wrongly detained, excessive force.
Right.
Maybe even violence against migrants who are already incredibly vulnerable.
And what about, families, communities?
Yeah. It's hard to grasp the ripple effect this could have, the trauma of being separated, the economic hardship.
It's huge. It's immense.
And it's not just the people directly affected.
No, this kind of system could completely change American society.
Really?
Think about it. Imagine a world where everyone's suspicious of everyone else, where fear is just built into everyday life.
That's a scary thought.
It is. Where you can't even trust your neighbors. Where people are afraid to help each other, because they're scared of getting caught up in the system.
Exactly.
So you're saying this proposal, it's not just about immigration.
It's about the very fabric of who we are as a country.
Wow. And some people would argue that's just the price we got to pay.
The price for security, for protecting our borders.
Right. Some people would say, look, this is just what we got to do.
That's a dangerous line of thought.
What?
It pits security against compassion, we can't have both.
Right.
Upholding the law means throwing human rights out the window. We can do both. We should strive for both.
Yeah, we're better than that. It seems like this proposal is saying we can't. Security means we have to sacrifice our values.
Right, and that's a slippery slope.
Totally.
Once we start going down that road,
it's
really hard to turn back.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's important to remember, we're a country built by immigrants. Diversity is a strength. It's not a weakness. And that's something this proposal seems to just completely ignore.
It does. And it's something we can't afford to forget.
So let's say this proposal does gain traction. What can people do about it? How can they push back?
Well, there are things we can do. We can contact our representatives.
Make our voices heard.
Exactly. Support groups that are fighting for immigrant rights.
Yeah.
Educate ourselves and each other about what's really going on.
Challenge that hateful rhetoric that's out there.
Exactly.
Stand up for the people who are being marginalized.
And remember, collective action has power. Throughout history, ordinary people coming together have created change.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed by all this, but we can't give up. We can't just sit back and do nothing.
We can't afford to be complacent.
Mm-hmm.
We each have a role to play in shaping the future of this country. We can't just be bystanders.
Okay, so we've talked about what could happen if this plan goes forward, but where do things stand right now? Is it actually happening?
Right now, no indication the government is seriously considering it.
Okay.
A lot of legal experts are skeptical. Even some former immigration officials have said, wait a minute, this is a problem.
So it's probably safe to say it's not going to happen.
I wouldn't be so sure.
Oh, no.
Remember, we've seen this administration ignore expert advice.
Right.
They've gone against legal precedent when it suits them.
So you're saying, this thing's a zombie. It might be dead now, but it could come back to life.
That's a good way to put it. We need to stay vigilant. Watch for any sign that this is gaining traction.
Okay, so what are the red flags? What should we be looking out for?
Well, we've already touched on some of them. More money for ICE, attempts to change immigration laws, maybe even declaring a national emergency.
Yeah, okay, those are pretty big, obvious things. What about, are there more subtle signs we should be aware of?
This is where it gets really interesting. Pay attention to the rhetoric. What are certain politicians saying? What are certain media outlets pushing? Are they ramping up the fear about immigration?
Okay, yeah.
Are they painting immigrants as dangerous? As a threat to our safety?
Are they using language that dehumanizes immigrants?
Exactly. The way we talk about something, it shapes how we think about it. And if the conversation is all fear and prejudice,
it's easier to accept extreme solutions.
Exactly.
So it's not just about what they do, it's about what they say, the climate they create.
That's it. The narrative they're pushing. We need to be aware of those subtle shifts, the coded language.
Yeah.
Because that can be just as dangerous as any policy.
Wow. Okay, so we need to be vigilant, pay attention to what they do and what they say.
Absolutely.
But let's say, hypothetically, this proposal does start to get some momentum.
Mm-hmm.
What might we see? Like, what are some possible scenarios?
One possibility is they try to do it bit by bit.
Instead of all at once.
Yeah, incrementally. Start with more money for ICE, more detention centers, make it easier to deport people for smaller offenses.
So a slow creep toward privatization instead of one big change.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Test the waters, see how much resistance they face.
Yeah.
And if people push back, they can always say, hey, we're just enforcing the law.
Protecting our borders.
Right. But in the meantime,
Yeah.
they're normalizing this idea of private contractors in law enforcement.
Making it easier to expand their role later on.
That's the danger. Once you open that door, it's hard to close it.
Okay, so that's one scenario. What else? What other possibilities are there?
Another possibility is they go all in, try to push the whole thing through at once.
Wow, that's bold.
It is. They might use executive orders or declare a national emergency, bypass Congress completely.
That just seems like a recipe for chaos.
It would be risky, absolutely.
Yeah.
Probably face legal challenges immediately.
Right.
Huge protests.
Yeah.
But we can't rule it out, right?
I mean, no, we've seen them disregard the law, the Constitution even.
Exactly. And they've been very good at using fear and division to silence critics.
To rally their base.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's possible they try to force this through.
Even if it tears the country apart.
That's the scary part. This proposal, it goes beyond just immigration. It's about what kind of democracy we want, what kind of country we want to be.
Those are some big questions, and we've only just scratched the surface.
We have.
But I think this has been a really good starting point. It's helped me understand just how complicated this issue is.
Me too.
And how high the stakes are.
Absolutely.
So we've talked about what could happen if this plan goes ahead. We've talked about where things stand right now.
Mm-hmm.
But what does this mean for our listeners?
That's the big question.
Why should they care about a plan that, might never even happen?
Because this is a warning sign.
Or,
A canary in the coal mine.
okay, I like that. What do you mean?
It shows us a trend that's been growing. Democracy being weakened, fear and division on the rise,
Right.
people willing to give up our values for a false sense of security.
It's a wake-up call. We can't take our freedoms for granted. We can't take our democracy for granted.
Exactly.
We have to be involved. We have to be informed. We have to be active if we want to shape the future we want to see.
Couldn't have said it better myself. This has been a pretty intense deep dive.
It has.
And I know it's a lot to take in, but hopefully it's been informative. It's given you something to think about.
And more importantly, I hope it's inspired you to get involved. To speak up, to fight for the kind of world you want to live in.
Because silence is complicity.
Apathy is surrender.
We all have a role to play in shaping the future. We can't just sit back and watch. We have to be active participants in the fight for a better world, a more just world, a more humane world. It does. And that brings us to Michael Moore's piece. He really goes all in, calling this proposal a power grab.
Yeah, a coup, he actually said.
Yeah, straight up coup.
Yeah.
His piece is definitely the most provocative we looked at.
Definitely the most strongly worded, I'd say. He's basically saying this isn't about immigration at all.
Right. He's arguing it's about taking down our democratic institutions and consolidating power.
So he's saying it's about something way bigger than just deportations.
Exactly. He's saying this fits into a pattern we've been seeing, pushing boundaries, ignoring the rules.
So in that context, is a radical move on immigration really that surprising?
That's his point. Even if you don't agree with everything Moore says, he's raising important questions about what's really going on.
Okay, so we've got a range of opinions. Some people genuinely worried about illegal immigration, others seeing this as just, a way to grab power.
Exactly. It's a very polarized issue.
It is.
Yeah.
But let's just for a second, put the politics aside
Okay.
and focus on the impact. We talked logistics, we talked ethics, but what about the human cost? What about the people this would actually affect?
It's hard to even imagine what it would be like.
Yeah, I mean, to live every day with that fear of deportation hanging over you.
Constantly looking over your shoulder, never knowing if a traffic stop or just, going about your day could lead to being separated from your family.
Being ripped away from your life.
Exactly. Your job, your whole life just gone.
Man, That's heavy. And it makes me think back to Lorette's story, the Blackwater contractor.
Right. His account is really powerful.
He talked about becoming so emotionally detached that he could inflict fear and violence without even thinking twice.
Yeah. Still.
So if that's the mindset of the people in charge of carrying out these deportations,
It's a scary thought.
what kind of system are we creating?
One where human rights are just ignored.
Just disregarded.
In the name of efficiency, in the name of profit. I mean, we could see wrongful detentions, excessive force, even violence against migrants who are already vulnerable.
It's like we're building a system that rewards cruelty.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And the impact on families and communities, it's impossible to calculate.
The trauma of separation, the economic hardship, it's huge.
It's beyond huge.
Yeah.
And it goes beyond just the individuals directly affected.
Okay, how so?
This kind of system, it changes the whole fabric of society.
You're saying it affects everyone, not just immigrants.
Exactly. Imagine a world where everyone's suspicious of everyone else, constantly afraid.
Neighbors can't trust each other.
People are afraid to help someone in need because they're scared of getting caught up in the system.
So it creates this climate of fear, of division.
And it undermines our democracy, our values.
And some people might say, well, that's the price of security.
Right. That's what we have to give up to protect our borders.
Exactly.
But that's a false choice. We don't have to choose between security and compassion, between upholding the law and respecting human rights.
We can have both.
We should strive for both. But this proposal is saying we can't. It's saying security requires us to sacrifice our values.
And that's dangerous.
It is. It's a slippery slope. Once we start down that path, it's hard to turn back.
Absolutely. And it's so easy to forget that, we're a nation of immigrants.
That's right. Our diversity is what makes us strong.
It's not something to be afraid of.
Exactly. But that's the message this proposal is sending.
So let's say this does gain traction, hypothetically. Yeah. What can people do? How do we fight back against this?
There are a lot of things we can do. Contact our elected officials, make sure our voices are heard.
Support organizations fighting for immigrant rights.
Right. Educate ourselves and others about what's really going on.
Challenge the hateful rhetoric. Stand up for those who are being marginalized.
And remember, collective action has power. Throughout history, social change has happened because ordinary people came together and demanded justice.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed by all of this, to feel like there's nothing we can do.
I know, but we can't give in to apathy or despair.
We can't afford to be bystanders.
We each have a role to play in shaping the future of our country. We can't be silent.
Okay, so we've talked about the potential consequences and about how people can get involved. But where does this proposal stand right now? Is it actually happening?
As of right now, there's no indication the government is seriously considering it.
Okay, so it's dead in the water.
I wouldn't go that far. Remember, we've seen this administration ignore expert advice, disregard legal precedent when it suits them.
So it's like a zombie. It might be dead now, but it could come back to life.
Exactly. We need to stay vigilant, watch for any signs that this is gaining traction.
Like what are the red flags we should be looking out for?
Well, we already mentioned some. Increased funding for ICE, changes to immigration laws, even declaring a national emergency.
Right. Those are all pretty big, obvious moves. Are there any more subtle things we should be watching for?
This is where things get interesting. We need to pay close attention to the rhetoric, what certain politicians are saying, what some media outlets are pushing. Are they ramping up the fear about immigration?
Like demonizing immigrants, portraying them as a threat.
Exactly. The way we talk about an issue shapes how we think about it. And if the conversation is dominated by fear and prejudice,
it becomes easier to accept extreme solutions.
Exactly. So it's not just about the concrete actions. It's about the climate they create, the narrative they're pushing.
We need to be aware of those subtle shifts in language, the coded messages.
Because that can be just as dangerous as any policy.
Okay, so vigilance is key. Pay attention to what they do and what they say.
Absolutely. But let's say, hypothetically, this proposal does start to gain some momentum. What are some scenarios we might see play out? One possibility is they try to implement it piecemeal, bit by bit.
Instead of all at once.
Right. Start by increasing funding for ICE, expanding detention capacity, making it easier to deport people for minor offenses.
So a slow creep towards privatization rather than a sudden dramatic shift.
Exactly. Test the waters, see how much pushback they get. And if they face resistance, they can always say, we're just enforcing the law or protecting our borders.
Right, and in the meantime, they're normalizing the idea of private contractors in law enforcement, making it easier to expand their role in the future.
That's the danger. Once that door is open, it's hard to close it.
Okay, so that's one scenario. Incremental implementation. What are some other possibilities?
Another scenario is they try to push through the whole plan all at once, maybe using executive orders or declaring a national emergency to bypass Congress.
That sounds incredibly chaotic.
It would be a risky move, for sure. Likely face immediate legal challenges and massive public outcry.
But it's not outside the realm of possibility, is it? I mean, we've seen this administration disregard the law and the Constitution before.
That's true. And we've also seen them use fear and division to silence critics and rally their base.
So we can't rule out the possibility that they might try to ram this through, even if it means tearing the country apart.
That's the frightening part. This proposal goes beyond just immigration. It's about the very core of our democracy, what kind of country we want to be.
We're talking about some pretty fundamental questions here.
We are, and the stakes are incredibly high.
Yeah.
This isn't just about the fate of 12 million people. It's about the soul of America.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. From the potential impacts to the current status of the proposal to possible scenarios for the future. But what does it all mean for our listeners? Why should they care about a plan that might never even see the light of day?
Because this is a canary in the coal mine. It's a reflection of a larger trend we're seeing. The erosion of democratic norms, the rise of fear and division, the willingness to sacrifice our values for a false sense of security.
It's a wake-up call, a reminder that we can't take our freedoms and our democracy for granted.
We have to be engaged, informed, and actively involved in shaping the future we want.
This deep dive has given us all a lot to think about, but we don't want to leave you feeling overwhelmed or hopeless.
Here's a thought to consider. What if all the energy and resources being poured into this deportation plan were redirected towards something positive?
Imagine investing in education, job training, affordable housing, healthcare for everyone. Imagine a society where everyone has the opportunity to thrive regardless of their background.
That's the kind of future we should be working towards. A future where we embrace our diversity, where we uphold our values, where we create a more just and equitable society for everyone.
That's a powerful vision. And it's a reminder that we have a choice. We can choose fear and division, or we can choose hope and unity. We've spent this deep dive, really digging into this proposal to change how deportation works in the U.S. And it's easy to get lost in the weeds, all the politics, the logistics, the numbers. Mm-hmm. But we can't forget about the people, the real human stories behind all of this.
It's easy for those stories to get lost in all the noise.
Yeah. That's why I keep thinking about Loret's piece, the former Blackwater contractor.
His account is powerful.
It really brings home that human cost, not just for the people being deported, but for the people doing the deporting too.
His description of the mercenary mindset, that lack of emotion, empathy, it's chilling.
It really is.
It shows what can happen when we prioritize, efficiency and profit over compassion and just basic human dignity.
It's like we're creating a system that's designed to turn people into robots.
In a way.
To shut off their humanity, to just become part of this machine that processes and deports people.
It raises a fundamental question. What kind of society are we building when we dehumanize an entire group of people?
Yeah, when we create a system that rewards cruelty and indifference.
That's the question we need to be asking ourselves.
It is. And it goes beyond just our stance on immigration.
It's about the kind of world we want to live in.
Exactly. Do we want a world ruled by fear and division? Or do we want a world that strives for justice, compassion, understanding?
Those are the stakes.
And the choices we make today, they determine what path we take.
That's right. So where do we go from here? How do we ensure we're moving toward a more humane and just future?
I mean, for one, we have to stop trying to oversimplify this issue.
It's complex.
It is. There aren't any easy answers, and there are valid points on all sides.
We need to be willing to have those tough conversations.
The nuanced ones, the ones that recognize that complexity.
But always holding on to our values. Fairness, justice, dignity.
Absolutely. We have to call out that hateful rhetoric, that fear-mongering.
It's everywhere. We can't let it become the norm.
We need to support those organizations that are fighting for immigrants, for refugees.
Yes, they're doing incredible work.
We need to educate ourselves, educate others, really understand the issues, the consequences of our choices.
And most importantly, we have to get involved.
Yeah.
Contact your representatives, volunteer your time, donate to organizations working on the front lines.
Silence is complicity. Apathy is surrender. like you said before, we each have a role to play in shaping the future.
We do. We can't just be bystanders.
So this deep dive, it's been a lot of information, a lot to think about. Hopefully it's given you some insights into this complicated issue.
I hope so.
But more importantly, I hope it's lit a fire under you.
And giving you that push to act, to make a difference.
Because ultimately, the future, it's not something that just happens to us.
We create it.
We do. So keep questioning, keep learning, keep fighting for the world you want to see.